Well, Browncroft, welcome to the first ever edition of Between Two Sermons. Rob Catalani, myself, John Amayo here. We came up with this really, novel idea, fantastic idea, because we came up with it.
Absolutely.
And that we would try to go and say, hey, how about if we reflected on the sermon from this past week? And then said, what did we have to cut out? What did we have to say we weren't able to put that in there that people might actually grow from and be interested in? So this is the first opportunity that we're going for this.
Let's do it.
Hopefully people will like it. If they don't, they can blame us.
Right.
And hopefully
it's on them.
That's right. So, so Rob, I'll take it off the top here. We're starting this new series.
Yeah.
You just started it this Sunday on 1 Corinthians.
Yep.
Why 1 Corinthians? Why did you choose this book?
Yeah.
We're going to be going over it for the course of the better part of the year, really.
Yeah.
So why this book?
Well, it's a great question. I say a little bit about it on Sunday, but back to the cutting room floor, so to speak, or what didn't make it in there. I didn't say as much as I'd like to. But, I would say I have lived, like all of us have, but you and I as pastors, for 2 years through a very unusual time. Not just the coronavirus, which we all experienced, but how has that impacted our culture? I think in some significant ways. Some people would say this: the coronavirus was not a cause, it was an accelerant. Whether it was the economy, whether it was my hot or cold spirituality, maybe it was, a marital problem, a job change. It was an accelerant, and I think that was true in our culture. And a lot of things have happened in the culture, and a lot of things, I don't know, maybe some things are raw, some things have matured. And one of the things, of course, as you know, John, being here with me, is some major issues. I mean, our culture, whether it's race in our culture, whether it's the economics of our culture, whether it's the identity politics of our culture. We just lived through a very politically charged time. And I think that has impact on everyday people that come to church. And I think the summary, I would say, is why 1 Corinthians. I think 1 Corinthians was a congregation that was in many ways grappling with a lot of the things we're grappling with. That is to say, it was a congregation of people who were living in a world that was changing, in a world that was had a lot of a competition for the gospel. You might say Paul uses the only time he ever uses the term carnal Christian. We didn't get into this Sunday. Is in this book, and it's another way. Maybe you and I would say a very worldly Christian. Another way of saying, you and I have said this before. Every Christian needs to come to an understanding. Every parent, but every individual, that the world is trying to disciple you and me right along with the church. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to come to this book. I see this as the Apostle Paul, as the author, writing to a congregation that you might say was saturated with ideas about the world that were in contrary, let's say, even in some cases, in strong opposition to the gospel. And I think we live in a day like that today. So I thought it would be good to take obviously these are 2,000-year-old book, but to say, what does this book say to us about the church?
Yeah, was there anything that you, in your research, that you found out about those group of Christians that you weren't able to bring to all of us? That you go, man, this really struck me about this group of people.
Yeah, well, one of the things anyway, it said, the original church in Corinth was on kind of an isthmus, which is a fancy word for a land bridge. And because of it, it was between, some say it was a trade route between East and West, between, let's say, Italy and Asia. And that because of that, it was a commercial city, but it was also a place only founded about 50 years before the time of Jesus. It was a new city, but that people came to it. I don't know if maybe New York City would be an example anymore, but people came to it from all other places to kind of reinvent themselves. One of the books I read talked about the rootlessness of people, that, they came to this place, yes, to make money, in a sense to restart their life, but to make a name for themselves. And so that was something I don't think even in all of my years of reading the Bible, the New Testament, that I ever fully appreciated that. And I feel, anyway, that today in the culture that you and I live. We live in a time of where that's going on seems to be in such great measure. You would probably have a lot to say working with college students. So you're closer to that season of life where people are doing that. But I think even older people, right, are trying to reinvent themselves, are trying to say, who am I? And how do I mostly distinguish myself in identity politics or in, even creating new identities? These are new ideas. So I think that's one of the things I learned that really piqued my interest about Paul's writing to people, which is not true of every one of his letters. He's not always writing to people that have that.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring that up. My mind naturally went before you said college students.
Yeah.
Like, of course, I spent 20 years working with college students.
Right.
That's what I thought about. But the more you explained it, I'm thinking, well, there's a lot of people that are doing that now.
Right.
So it's almost like Corinth was the internet before there was the internet.
Yeah, it's a good way to think of it.
They were living, this new identity that they were creating for themselves. And a lot of people, you don't have to be young to do that. A lot of people live this persona online.
Yeah.
And they have a different persona in person.
Yeah.
Or who am I really?
That's right. So big when you think about our culture.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's an interesting parallel there. This past sermon that you talked a lot about identity.
Yeah.
So here's one question I have for you. If you were going to give your sermon, you wanted people to tweet your sermon from this past week and put it in a tweet, what's the one thing you would want them to convey from what you just said?
I think it would be that in the gospel, if you're a Christian, okay, so this isn't true for non-Christians, in the gospel, you are given a new identity. And that's so important for two big reasons. One, sometimes we think of the gospel, you and I do, and the gospel is where I've received the forgiveness of sins. The gospel is where I, enter into a relationship with Jesus, life-changing relationship with Jesus. That's true. The gospel, ultimately, you might say, is my a ticket to heaven. Jesus says, in my Father's house are many mansions, etc. I'm going to bring you back. You have an ultimate destiny. All of that is true. But I think the emphasis here is that the gospel doesn't just save your soul, it gives you a whole new identity, being born again, etc. And I think that's something that is greatly underappreciated for Christians. And the more it's underappreciated, right? I'm created anew in Christ Jesus. I think those words are even used, if not in 1 Corinthians, in other passages in the sermon. We're given a new creation in Christ. And if that's underappreciated, then I can live my life as a Christian largely in defeat or in under-realized purpose, because I'm saved, but I'm not living out of a new identity. So I'd say that's the most important big idea that I'd like to communicate, not just this Sunday, but going forward in this series.
Yeah, I feel like when, as communicators, oftentimes we key in on a message that we feel is meaningful to us when we're trying to communicate in a passage.
Absolutely.
So where has that overlap for you in your life? Like, where have you felt like, man, I really needed to grasp this identity in Jesus on a deeper level for you?
Well, I gave an illustration, I won't re-give it here, but about the difference between failing and being a failure.
Yes.
So I think for me, as I thought about that concept, and I think about not only the Apostle Paul who wrote this, he said later in the New Testament, I am the chief of sinners. He wasn't just being, colorful. Why was he a chief sinner? Because he was a mercenary and he actually hunted down people, we assume killed people, for the cause, his cause, which was to stamp out Christianity. And he came to a place and said, how is it possible that I could now be a representative of this faith? And the only way he could do that is to realize that there was something deeper in his foundation, his identity, his new identity, than even the gravest of failures. Same with Peter. So I think for me, John, I have in my life, past and present, I wish I could say it was all in the past, have felt where I have failed as a friend, in a relationship, as a leader, and at times have felt like I'm disqualified, I'm unworthy, and but this reminds me. So Paul starts this letter, which is really to a bunch of, you might say, bad actors, immature people, but he starts, you don't see any of that yet. This opening sermon just says, let me affirm what is the truest thing about you. What is the truest thing about you? I want you to know that, congregation, I think he's saying. And so for me, it's helpful. When I think about, I can wake up every day and humbly say, I am God's son, and in me God is well pleased because of the work of Jesus, and that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think we can all resonate with that.
Yeah.
I think every person listening right now, every person there on Sunday can resonate at some level with that. What you just shared. And I appreciate you bringing that up. I think as you have leaned into this, you've obviously explored different resources. You mentioned some of them even on Sunday in your sermon. What ones have stood out to you as really beneficial and maybe helpful for other people as they begin this journey of studying First Peter?
I brought some at least. I'll just do it quick. One is, most congregation members probably don't read commentaries, but some do. And this one is new. So I always read, like you do, a handful of commentaries, biblical commentaries for a sermon. But this one, I think, was published very recently, and let's see, 2015, so kind of recently, by a guy I think you said you knew.
Yeah.
So, is that how you say his last name?
Stephen Yep.
Sorry.
Yep.
So I just found this. I remember you mentioned you knew it. So I would say this, even though it seems like a big book, a couple hundred pages, but if anybody really wanted to say, I want to read a commentary, I want to go a step further than even notes in a study Bible, I really think this is well written and very accessible. So that's one.
Yeah.
And then a couple other books that I did mention, both I'd say by Christians, but one is not really a Christian book, so to speak, was Ross Douthat's book called A Decadent Society, America Before and After the Pandemic. And what he's basically saying, he's a newspaper columnist, thoughtful, I'd say Catholic Christian is the way he describes himself. But he's basically saying, who is America? What is, you might say, the fancy word would be zeitgeist, but what is the spirit of our age? And how is it reflective of what he would say is maybe what's happened in the last 24 months is real. I mean, there's been some real. I'm talking about the movements, the mini revolutions, the cultural shakeups, whether that's talking about areas of race or areas of economics or even the politics. Maybe some of things are real. Maybe this is the 1960s or the 1930s all over again. Or what his premise is maybe this is only skin deep. Maybe this is here today, gone tomorrow, and it's really a reflection of a decadent society. What's a decadent society? A society that's been so, been so accommodated to luxury and pleasure and, the good life. I'm talking about materialism. In consumerism, that they get involved in ideas for a time and they move away. They reinvent themselves every so couple years. And what we've seen in the last 24 months is just another version of reinvention. So that's what that book's about. Interesting, and I think it has some implications, perhaps, for the church. And then this one, Orthodoxy, which is perhaps less known from the standpoint of friends that are watching this today, unless you're a long-term deep dive Christian of a kind. But the book, Orthodoxy, written by G.K. Chesterton. Who's G.K. Chesterton? Many people wouldn't know him, but they'd know C.S. Lewis. And many people would say G.K. Chesterton preceded Lewis. They probably overlapped some years on this planet, but he preceded him as a writer, a thinker, a theologian. But became a Christian as an adult, was a very, very smart man, and this book is kind of a book of, it's sort of his testimony, but also his book of what we call apologetics. That is, how can I make the Christian faith make sense to a skeptical audience? So it's a classic. He wrote, I think, 40 books, but this is the one that he's most well known for. So
Orthodoxy.
Orthodoxy, that's the name of the book. Yeah. So those are just some books that I thought were very helpful.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think people, depending on where people are on the spectrum, they can pick one of those up.
Yeah.
And
that's a short book, and even Douthat's book is not long. Yeah, if you're interested in it.
Well, what else is there? Like, is there anything else that you feel like you really want to communicate, or from this past week, or even as you think through to the future, that you want people to internalize in their own life?
I think the big idea is, and hopefully we'll do justice to this over the course of not just these 7 weeks, but the weeks and a few months that follow in January and into next year, is the sort of title, or let's say the subtitle of this entire thing, which is seeing all of life through the gospel. That's what I want to communicate. And even though I've been a Christian for a long time and hopefully thoughtful in working on my faith, I'm still grasping this very simple idea that the gospel is not a transaction. The gospel is not a pass-through. The gospel is not even, like a pill that I swallow, spiritually speaking. It is those things, but it's a whole new reality. You might say the gospel is the thing that the time capsule, I don't know if that's the right word, that ultimately has the power to remake your life from the inside out. I was talking to this may be a bad or an imperfect metaphor, and I don't know anyone would even seen this movie. It's probably a dozen years old or 20 years old, called Pleasantville. I don't even know if I ever saw the whole movie. But here's all I remember from the trailer of the movie. I think it had something to do when people kiss, they went from black and white to color. I don't even know if that's the premise of the movie. But I remember the first time I ever saw the image, I thought it was powerful. It was in the trailer. And it's you might say the gospel is this thing that you might say is supposed to, over time, if you and I engage it, if we learn how to appropriate it, right? Seeing all of the life through the gospel, that does turn you and I, you might say, from black and white to color, in a manner of speaking. And that's a powerful idea. And it takes our whole lives. But the sad thing is, which I think this book gets to, is many people, past and present, may live long lives. They may be Christian for 40 years and maybe go to church like this one, but for whatever reason, they're still black and white, so to speak. So that's I think that's the big idea, and it's what I hope to play with and communicate more over the course of this series.
Yeah, I love that, and I love the picture of our church becoming a place that is more vibrant, if you will. That we're experiencing the gospel in our lives, and that's not just something that's intellectual or we're checking it off of our list, but that it's actually changing our lives from the inside out.
Yeah.
I know that's what we dream of when we think about Browncroft as a place to be, people experiencing God and Jesus in a real way, and life change in a real way.
A true life change. And it's life, I think our mission statement says, inviting people into a life-changing relationship. I love that. In other words, that's the idea. It's ongoing. Right. I've been a Christian, maybe you and I are around the same length of years or close to it, decades. And a couple things are true. I can say about me today. I'm sure you'd say the same. You got a ways to go, brother. Okay, then it's decades. And number two, I feel like, in a strange way, the more I know, that is, the more I'm a Christian, read and pray, etc., the less I know. In other words, which is another way of saying, I realize how much there is I yet to know about who Christ is, about what has actually happened to me. So that's sobering and exciting at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. It is a very humbling thing to approach the gospel in that way, that it is this lens that which we see all of life through, and it is constantly, no matter what state we're in, we're constantly being confronted by our own issues that we have, and it's revealing new things inside of us, and as well as producing new fruit inside of us at the same time. So, well, thanks for sharing this.
Love it.
For being part of this. Looking forward to going over next week's sermon with you. This has been a great time. So
enjoyed it. Thank you.
And I hope you guys all had a great time too. And hopefully we will see you not just here, but in
the
church.
Next between the sermon.
Between two sermons.
Between two sermons.
That's right. All right. Catch ya.